All right, we're going to go ahead and take a call from Nick. Nick is a theist coming out of New York, and he says, regarding the Gospels, do you believe Christ was completely fabricated or a real person?
Ooh.
You're on AXP with Emma and Johnny. Emma, please answer this question.
Well, again, I'm not the expert. I just absorb as much as I can from the experts and then forget about 70% of it.
Hmm.
As I understand it, the majority of New Testament scholars hold that there probably was a Jesus. There were certainly preachers roaming around at that time. It seems likely that there was a Jesus that some of the stories were based on. So that's my sort of position.
Okay. Nick,
Hello.
what is
Oh,
what?
hi. Sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't know if you were going to speak. Let me just say, by the way, I think you both have amazing speaking voices, and you should definitely do work for like Audible or something like that, because I would totally listen
Oh,
to a book by
It's the
either one of you.
microphone. On this end, it's just the microphone. Thanks, Nick.
yeah.
Emma,
Go no, but
yeah.
seriously, go to my channel, go to my website, contact my agent, put in a word.
Okay.
Thanks
Duly
a lot, Nick.
noted.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, part of the reason I'm calling is because I'm kind of having an extended conversation with an atheist friend of mine.
Mhm.
And we're ironing out each other's worldviews and where are the inconsistencies and things like that. And one of the things, it's raised a question in my mind regarding, so I'm a Christian,
Mhm.
regarding the Gospels itself. There's, my understanding of atheist challenge to like the New Testament is that there are external problems and then internal problems in terms of like internal inconsistencies within the New Testament. The things inside don't add
Mhm.
up. And one of the propositions I've heard put forward is that, basically it says things that we believe are impossible, a resurrection, miracles, healing people, walking on water, changing water into wine, these kind of things. So we kind
Mhm.
of by default know that this is not true, and must therefore to some degree be fabricated. But
Mm.
one of the problems I'm having with that view is that when I read through the Gospels, one of the striking things about Christ, well, first, just in general, I think Christianity puts forward kind of a unique worldview. Most religions that I'm aware of, and I would say all outside of Christianity, put this forward that we merit salvation and we go to heaven by our good works in this life. So we do good and then God rewards us. But Christianity is unique in that it posits that we actually can't earn salvation. That's something that has to be earned for us, and it's through belief in Christ that a person is justified. And my question is, what is it? It seems illogical to me, at least. I'd love to hear where you guys think the flaws in this logic are. It seems illogical to suggest that the authors of the New Testament would knowingly fabricate a figure like Jesus and then claim that the only way to salvation is to put faith in this fictitious character that they know is completely fictitious. Especially when you consider the fact that Jesus' standards for perfection are so unattainably high that they would condemn even the authors of the New Testament. Like even the people who made him up wouldn't meet his standards. So I feel like it's more logical to suggest that the New Testament is actually a form of first century journalism rather than a myth or legend, and that these events, the events depicted in the Gospels, are things that actually happened in history. But you just let me say a lot, so I'd love to hear your reactions to what I said.
Go ahead,
So
Emma.
I sit somewhere in the middle of you, and I'm guessing this is your atheist friend that you were talking about having a discussion with that posits the other sort of side. Um, I would sit in the middle of these two arguments. I think that sort of suggested atheist position, and I have heard atheists say this quite a lot. And I enjoy the Bible as a series of books. I think it's a mistake to consider the New Testament a something when it's a collection of books by different authors from different times. Um, I think it's a fascinating book, and I think it's a shame that so many atheists do have this approach where they say, if it's in the Bible, it's not real, because that's not fundamentally how these texts come together. We have an amazing history, and this is extends to politics as well as religion, talking about martyrs. Catholicism has a huge history of doing this, where we mix historical and what you would call sort of journalism. I don't know if I would call it journalism, because we know that a lot of the Gospels, for example, were written quite a number of years after the events that it was supposed to be representing. We have this history throughout all of human history of mixing historical with legend, whether it's to make a certain figure like Jesus or a certain political leader sound better, sound cooler. A lot of one of the potential reasons that there are some similarities between stories about things Jesus did and stories about other historical figures is this sort of idea of every faith is essentially trying to prove that our guy, for example, Jesus, is like them, but even better. And so you have sort of legends piling on top of history, and it's there's a word for that in Catholicism that I've completely forgotten. It's this sort of like a mix of biographies, but and they contain much true information that we know there's a lot of true information because we can verify via other sources that certain things happened. There's also a lot of things where it seems utterly fantastical, and that is the sort of legendary part of it. Especially, you got to remember that a lot of these things are being conferred orally. People are hearing stories from people who hear stories and then writing that down. And some we don't know the motivation of all the gospel authors. Some of them might have just been trying to write a really cool story based on this guy they heard about. I feel like I've now talked for a long time, but do you kind of understand where I'm coming from, Nick?
I do, yeah, and I would have, it's all great what you said. I would have a number of questions. I don't want to jump in out of order, though. Does the other host want to respond as well, or do you want to hear my reaction? Or hello? Did you?
Yeah, I'm here. I hear you. I think
Okay,
I'd like to
sorry.
hear. I think I'd like to hear your reaction to that. Yeah. Hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you said a few things there. For one of the questions I asked as I was becoming a Christian, which touched on some of the things you said, is what would I expect from the first century versus today? I think if a resurrection happened today, there would be a certain immediacy to the documentation of that event, right? I'm using that as one example, by the way, but in terms of having documents that don't exist for a number of years after the event, I would say two things. I would say, one, if we had documentation that was day one, like the resurrection happened and that day or that month or that year we had an account, do you think that's evidence that would necessarily convince everyone, or would you consider that to be more compelling as a form of evidence?
Yeah, it would be additional
Okay.
historical. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut over you there. It would be additional historical contextual information that would probably convince more people. Obviously, it being written doesn't necessarily prove everything and won't convince everyone. It would just be a bit more documentation for the arsenal.
Yeah, and well, I think that's an important point you just made. Is the idea of something being universally persuasive. I don't know of a single factor that universally persuades anybody of any particular worldview, including atheism, including Christianity, anything. But also, I think when we examine ancient documentation, it actually is striking that there are gospels that date back as early as they do, because my understanding is the way, like you said, it's orally, things are passed down. These paper, like papyri and the ink they used and stuff like that, it was not easy to make that kind of stuff. It was not like you could go to an office next and just buy a stack of printer paper. To actually produce a book or a codex required a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of scribes. Like, not everybody knew how to write, not everybody knew how to command the language. Yeah. And so it seems to make sense that if there were documents that were being copied, that were written down and then being copied, the originals would kind of wear out. And so the fact that we find decades after fragments of copies seems to suggest to me that there actually were earlier manuscripts that we probably lost, specifically because that's exactly what we'd expect to find if those manuscripts were being copied by multiple people and passed around. And like
Sure.
when it comes to a town
The
and
only
one
problem
church
is,
has one letter, so
yeah, I agree with a lot of your points, Nick. It's just the problem is without having any original document, this is again, we're sort of like assuming that there was somebody who, you know, wrote something down day one. Again, the sort of people that were followers of Jesus particularly wouldn't have had that kind of access to, those sort of writing tools and such, as you say. Um, w- we by saying it might be that there were earlier documents, we don't know what they said. They might have said Jesus brought 10 loaves of bread and it was really cool and everybody loved him. And then somebody turned that into a fantastical story later on. It's not, that doesn't provide evidence for the original event, just the fact that there might have been documents at some
Right.
point.
If I may step in here, respectfully,
yeah, please.
Nick, a lot of there are plenty of atheists who don't believe that a Jesus existed at all, but that was a fabrication of Paul and other people like that. I don't really care about that argument because I think it's very speculative, and I think a lot of atheists are of the kind of legend persuasion that they believe that the stories of Jesus are sort of an unraveling of a legend of something that may have happened in reality in some form, but then they kept on getting bigger and bigger with the telling, right? But I think there's something quite telling of the way this information was conveyed to us now 2,000 years after the time that was supposed to be have taking place. We're talking about, at its heart, a a gesture by the divine that exists outside of time and space, right? To to get information to all of humanity from that point forward onward, right? A roadmap, you might say, on how to not burn in hell or be obliterated or to be saved. Think of it in a positive way, right? If you do these things, if you have this belief, if you listen to this message and you believe it, you're going to go to heaven, or you're going to at least you got a leg up on the people who don't know about the story, you don't believe it. Okay? If you're a divine entity and you have anything, you could do anything, like truly anything that's not logically impossible. Why would you choose to send um, yourself in the form of a traveling preacher to get a bunch of people to start preaching, stuff, and then have not even the people who who were there firsthand, but subsequent people start writing this stuff down, and then um, allow oral tradition to modify it, and allow writing scribal error, allow translation error, allow philosophers to take the words and take it in completely different contradictory directions. Why would you do that? If you didn't want to sow discord amongst the people who were trying their best to follow the rules that are laid out. It's just a really bad way of doing things. And I'll say I'm just a regular person. I'm not divine. And I can think of a few different ways of doing it that's better than relying on first century Judean um, people to write things down accurately. Um, and I'm just some schmuck, you know. Uh, some would say, well, for example, what? Well, I don't know. Like annually, God shows up and communicates something to every single human, and it's exactly the same, and it's in their native language. He appears to all people at once and gives us a message of hope. And some people would say, well, that would undermine our free will. And it's been said, and I'll say it again: Satan, the devil, Lucifer, and all the angels lived in heaven, bumped into God all the time at the water cooler or whatever they have up in heaven, and had conversations with God, I assume. All the saints in heaven, all the people who live in heaven now, who encounter God on some level, um, they know that God exists in a way closer than uh, the the us who live in a world where God shows up every year on December 25th and says, "Hey, good news. I'm still around and you should be kinder to each other. And here's some tips and tricks, work this out." God doesn't do that. And yet if God exists in heaven, either free will has to exist in heaven or none of this makes any sense. Or free will doesn't. None of this makes any sense. And so I'm losing my focus because we're at the end of the show. I really enjoy your call.
Okay.
We're sort of dancing around the core issue. And the core issue is, why on earth would you rely upon, semi-literate folks to tell a story that has the ultimate consequence for those people and be all powerful, all knowing, and all good? Why would you do that? It really doesn't make any sense. And so that's what this atheist
Well,
would say.
I could offer maybe a brief reply. I'm not cutting you off, am I? Was that the end of your thought?
No,
Or
sir. No, sir. I talk too much. Go
okay.
on. What do you got?
Oh no,
Yeah.
it's okay. I so just to go back to the beginning of what you said there initially and kind of expanded upon, I would say two things. I would say, there is probably an inherent, I don't know what word to say. I think there's a risk in saying that because I can't think of a reason for why God would do X, therefore there can't be a reason. I think
Sure.
if we're talking about a God who is good, like infinitely good and infinitely powerful, then we're also talking about a God who can have reasons for allowing things to happen that we can't think of. And so, like, I hear your point, and I actually think it's a good point. I'm not dismissing it at all. I'm just saying it seems to be, and maybe I'm not understanding it. It seems to be founded on the idea that because there's not a reason that's immediately obvious to you, therefore there can't be a reason. And I would question that and say, why? It's not immediately obvious to me that God can't have morally sufficient reasons for doing
Oh,
things the way He's doing them. And one,
yeah.
I was just going to button it really quick and just say one thing. So my dad is actually a physician, and I was talking to him about this once, and he said the basis of medicine is you trace symptoms back to a disease. You cure the disease, you get rid of the symptoms. And so from the Christian point of view, the thing that went wrong with reality is, I wish I had a better word for this, but I'm a Christian, you got to live into the character sometime. The thing that went wrong at the beginning was effectively humanity rebelling against God, basically rejecting God and saying, we want to do it our way.
Right.
It makes sense within that framework. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying within the framework, it makes sense then that the cure to that disease is that this has to be something that only God can forgive. And so God has to absorb the debt for that. If I go into somebody's house and I sit down on a chair and I break the chair, there's a debt. Now, either they're going to pay it or I'm going to pay it, but something got broken and there's a cost associated with that. It's just a consequence. And so I'm
Yeah.
using the word there,
Nick,
if we rebelled against God and that, go ahead.
Nick, you said something interesting, and
Yep.
I was going on a different direction on this one, but you said something fun.
Okay.
It's like a slip and fall case. All right. If I go into my
Mhm.
house, if I go into Emma's house and Emma says, "Have a seat, Johnny," and I sit down in the chair and the chair breaks and I fall down and hurt myself, I'm not responsible for that chair. I had no idea that the chair was broken. If Emma doesn't know that the chair is faulty, then there's a limitation as to what kind of liability that Emma can have if the chair just kind of happens. There's a limitation, okay? But if Emma knows the chair is broken, then Emma's certainly and definitely like financially liable for any injuries that I might suffer. Now that there's talk about you know like liability and tort law and stuff like that notwithstanding, God created the universe in such a way Well, first of all, God is outside of time and space and knows all consequences, knows exactly what I'm going to do. Not because they necessarily they're predetermined, but God can see all facets, knows exactly what's going to happen, right? God created a universe where he knew, or God knew, that humans would rebel. God could have created a universe where humans would rebel or would not rebel. God could have created a universe where they rebelled, but there were no stiff consequences for rebelling. God could have created a universe where there's a dialogue rather than an immediate punishment or immediate permanent consequences for those things. But instead, God created a scenario where uh, humans doing what they're going to do uh, have infinitely radical consequences for their limited behaviors. That doesn't make sense to me. There may be some God reason that is just, but until such time as I can comprehend what that is, by any sense of human justice, right? That's not just. And if God is infinitely merciful and infinitely just or whatever, then that wouldn't happen. Now, um, does that make any sense to you? I just
Of course.
it's okay. So let's say, for example, another analogy. And I'm going to cut it really short. Would you accept if I were to punch you in the face? I'm not going to do this, by the way. I would never do this. If I punched you in the face,
All right.
okay, right,
Uh-huh.
and then and it broke your tooth because I'm totally hard fists, whatever, and I punched you in the face, and then you were upset about it, and I said, "There's a reason for it, though. I got a reason for it. I'm not going to tell you what the reason is. But you should just believe that I have a reason for it. You wouldn't accept that, right? But you can look me in the
If
face and
you punched
actually
me in the
ask me,
face,
yeah, yeah, I had a reason for it, a perfectly just reason. But you don't accept it on face
but if
value,
you,
right? You would want
yeah,
to know
but
the
I'm
reason.
not. So what I'm getting, I think I'm losing track of what your analogy is in relationship to, because it's not my understanding. The biblical concept of God is one in which he punches us, so to speak, in the face and then says, I have a reason that I'm not going to give you. I mean,
Okay, the analogy
the
is this:
biblical
God sets
concept
up
of
this
Christ.
condition where
Oh, okay.
here's the situation. Here's the analogy. God sets up these preconditions for salvation and preconditions for damnation, right? They don't seem fair.
Mhm.
They don't seem just, right? They seem like they're stacking the deck against human beings, right? By human standards, they're not fair. People who don't have sufficient evidence, people who've never heard the word, people who by reason of biology or psychology or whatever it might be, are unable to believe in Jesus, right? And yet God has the consequence right then and there. It's the punch in the face. And I would say, that's not fair, right? I am upset at the punch in the face if this is real, right? And you're saying, well, there's God would have a reason for it. And I'm saying, I have a reason for punching you in the face. See, so it's that's my equivalence right there. I by any human standard, it makes no sense to me. And that's why one of the reasons why I reject the whole business.
Okay. And I would actually I would use another analogy and ask you a question. Um, how would you deal with this situation? By the way, hypothetically, I don't think this is something the Bible says directly,
You gonna
but I
punch me in
think
the
it's
face? Okay, go
implicit.
on. Go
No,
on.
no, no, not remotely. But I do take your point. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Supposing hypothetically that there is a heaven and there's a hell, and we die and we go to heaven and we see there's 1,000 people in hell, and that's it. That's just 1,000. And one day God goes down and he goes to hell and he opens the gates of hell and he says, all right, listen, anybody that wants to come out, come on out. Just come on out of hell. And 500 people leave. And a year goes by, 500 people stay, 500 people leave. A year goes by, he does the same thing. Anybody that wants to come out, come on out. 100 people leave, so now there's 400 left. And this goes on year after year until there's maybe 100 people left. And then over the next 1,000 or million or 10 million years of eternity, God every year goes down to the gate and says, if anybody wants to leave, they can. And year after year, for millions of years, that 100 people just says, we don't want anything to do with God. We don't want anything to do with heaven. we want to stay where we are. My understanding of the biblical conception of hell, in part, is that it's not, and the consequences that you're describing. Now, maybe this isn't a reaction to what you just said, so I apologize if that's the case, but the consequences is that it's not necessarily like God is stamping on the lid saying you can never get out. It's that the gates of hell, the old saying, of course, is the gates of hell are locked from the inside. And at past a certain point, it sounds like what you'd be asking God to do is essentially be a puppet master that forces people out of the decision that they are willingly telling you, hey, I don't want anything to do with God. And therefore, it seems like the natural consequence of that posture of heart would be for God to say, okay, you don't want anything to do with me. I won't have anything to do with you. And what in that line of thinking, this is not about is that true or false or anything like that, but what in that line of thinking is unfair or doesn't square up?
Emma?
Well, the thing is, in your analogy, Nick, God is there talking to people in hell, so they have they have the best evidence we could hope for that God is real and hell is real because they're seeing it. Whereas in reality, we don't have that. We're not looking at the Bible. God's face doesn't come out and go, "Hey, I'm real, believe in me." Although that is sort of similar to what's supposed to happen with the Holy Spirit, depending on your denomination. We don't have that. We don't have sufficient evidence. That's the position we're coming from. If God showed up and said, "Take me by the hand and show you through the streets of London," that's an old English song. Doesn't matter. I'm starting to get delirious, I think. If he took us by the hand and said, "Here's hell, here's heaven, here's me, God. I bestow upon you infinite understanding, and you now accept that I'm real," then we probably would make the decision to go with him. But this isn't the reality that we live in.
And if I may piggyback on that, that's Emma's response. And my response is, that's sick. So we've got a cosmic dictator, a cosmic, like Rambo 2 style, Viet Cong, U.S. Army prison camp situation where God opens the bamboo thatched trapdoor to the American POWs of all humanities, stuck below, saying, "You can come out anytime you want to. All you need but do is accept me as your Lord and personal Savior, the dominator of your existence. I shall make it pleasant to you. I shall make it an eternal paradise. All you need but do is serve me for eternity, and I shall love you in despair." All that stuff, right? And the sick. It's not how you're framing it, Nick, and it's not how you see God. But when you have this situation where God's opening this lid of hell and saying, "All right, you can come up. All you have to do is acknowledge that you're worse than me." What the hell? Do it some other way. Why have that scenario at all? And here's where I'm getting at. The whole scenario reads like, I'm not saying that you are in any way unintelligent or childlike. It reads like a fairy tale. It reads like something out of Bullfinch's mythology about the kind of crap that takes place in Hades and eating pomegranates and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't read like anything mature. It sounds like an early cultural attempt to explain what happens to humans when they don't follow the rules, when they don't accept the rules of society, when they all this stuff. It doesn't, if you weren't raised or if you didn't come to believe these things for logical reasons, I don't think you would ever arrive to this conclusion that this is the way that the universe is set up. It just sounds like a fairy tale. So that's the long way of saying it is like, my God, like, Nick, come on.
Yeah.
If it weren't God and it were
Yeah,
go ahead. Some other religion, you'd be like, what the hell's wrong with these people? Why do they believe this crap? But you believe it because it's kind of framed in your cultural understanding. think about it from another perspective, and I think that you'll find that it's just kind of nonsense. But I do appreciate you calling, Nick.